Thanks to everyone for coming today. So we typically do a land acknowledgement as part of these events, but Tara has told us that she has one as part of her presentation, so I'm going to leave that to her. So I'm just going to introduce our speaker today, Tara Webb. She is a theater artist specializing in costume design and costume technologies. She has collaborated with contemporary performance companies and artists that utilize interdisciplinary and contemporary playmaking and choreographic processes in San Francisco, New York, and Philadelphia. She's currently teaching costume technology for the UNCG School of Theater and is working on a local color palette of natural dyes from plants and organic materials as part of her UNCG Sustainability Faculty Fellowship. She has an MA in Visual Culture Costume Studies from NYU and a BA in Theater Studies from Swarthmore College. You can find more images of some of her previous costume design work at tarawebb.com. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Tara Webb.
Hello, everybody. It's so funny because I just realized I need to update my website. It's got some old stuff on it. It's been a few years. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides to share with everyone. So let me get there. Everybody see that okay? Great. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my research fellowship here at UNCG, which is actually a project that I started at Swarthmore College, I believe in 2017, maybe a little bit before that. But before we do that, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land we gather on here at UNC Greensboro has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of peoples, including indigenous peoples, including also the Kiowa and the Chirwa and many others. You can see on my screen here, this is from a website, I don't know if you've ever seen this, called native-land.ca, and you can look up any zip code, any area across the world, and it will tell you what territories exist that were inhabited by indigenous cultures, and it also includes language and treaties as well. So if you're interested in this area, this is a good thing to do. If you feel like it in the chat and you're not from the Greensboro area, or you'd like to tell us a little bit about the place that you're from, please do so. The reason I feel this is important is because we, by acknowledging the land, we're honoring and respecting the diverse indigenous peoples and other peoples connected to the territory on which we gather here today. And those peoples were here inhabiting the space long before colonization. And we are also honoring the people that exist in our community now, including those who have come before, those who are here presently, and those who will come after us. In this way, we position the land above ourselves, and that's selves with a capital S. I find this especially important in eco-based projects, such as the kind of work that I'm doing, because I feel that it helps me occupy the space in talking about what the spirit of a place is about. And that's why I like to acknowledge the position that we're in occupying this land. I also feel it's important to understand that we occupy a diverse community, and by sharing information about the places that we're from and where we identify in terms of space, it helps us talk about what the spirit of a place is, which is what I'm about to talk about. So, so if you'd like to share your info in the chat, please do so. Okay, so get to the next screen here. When in talking about, so I titled this lecture "Spirit of Place," which the Romans called genius loci. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I'm not a Latin speaker, so it's not my expertise. But there's an essay by a writer named Iris Brooke who talks about ethical building, and these are some definitions that Iris Brooke talks about in this essay of what spirit of place means. And by defining, in the Roman mythology, the genius loci was actually a creature or a person that what embodied the spirit of the place that we're in. But spirit of place can also mean a number of things. It can mean atmosphere, it can mean the essence of a place or the distinctiveness, it could mean energy, it could also mean like the different kinds of folk culture that are in the area. It's come to mean a lot of different things when we talk about spirit of place. But I also think that it's a way of centering ourselves in our relationship to the land. And that's my interest in it, and how it helps me talk about what is so-called local color, which is often referred to in folk cultures and literature as kind of the character of the place as we identify it. And so my way into that character is to understand how plants can make pigment that we can use in art processes. And there's I have a process that I'll talk about as we go along. Does anybody have any questions about that definition? No, no chats. Okay, cool. The other thing that I find that's important to talk about with spirit of place is that there are lots of different cultures where this idea exists. It's not just in our own American culture, but there are cultures all over the world where this is true. So, for example, in the Shinto religion, there are kami that are the temple guardian spirits. Sometimes earth artists like Andy Goldsworthy, if you know him, are considered exploring the contribution of what sculpture means in terms of spirit of place. And we also have, in Asian cultures, there's traditions like Feng Shui that talk about how the energy lines of the earth influence a particular area. And then, of course, there's ley lines in England where they talk about these different abodes of special beings, maybe that occupy the place. And this image on the screen is an oak tree that's outside of the Guilford County Courthouse. It's one of my favorite oak trees. It's been there a very long time. You can see that it's very big. And interestingly enough, oak trees also make some great dyes. And so I wanted to include it here because I think it looks like this great big hand. So I think it represents this kind of idea that I'm talking about. This is not a new idea necessarily. It's been around a long time, obviously. But some of the inspiration when I first started this project comes from a dyer named Sasha Dewar, who made this book called Natural Palettes, Inspiration from Plant-Based Color. And she also started creating these seasonal color wheels. This is a horrible image, but upload, but she went through her area. She lives in the Pacific Northwest and used plants to create all of these different colors in her area. And so one of the things I became really interested in is like every space that we live in has its own color opportunities. So the true definition of local color, at least in the dye terminology, is color that we can make from the world around us. And there's an incredible range of opportunity because we live in a natural world. And so by exploring this pigment process in my work in costumes, it allows me to understand my environment just a little bit better. And there are a lot of other dyers who have come across this over the years. In fact, Catherine Ellis, who is she's a weaver and natural dyer who talks about this, and she took a trip to Madagascar in particular. And there are, we live in an opportunity where there's lots of things that we can buy on the internet, and we're in a semi-urban environment here in Greensboro. But for example, in Madagascar, most of their pigments are going to come from the environment around them. And so it's this truly this idea of connectedness to the land in this particular way. And I think the other thing that is really exciting to me is that this is something that humans have been doing for thousands of years. And, you know, so one of the places that I started with is a community garden here at UNC Greensboro. This is my plot at over at the McKeever Street Community Garden. If you don't know about that, I highly recommend it. Faculty and students can get a plot there. I have 2 plots going now. One is dye plants and one is food, both of which will do dyes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And I also started a sort of DIY guerrilla garden behind our space at 326 Tate Street. So I consider this part of my local environment, which is one of the reasons I'm talking about that now. And maybe someday when I'm not here anymore, those plants will still be going, because plants, will, sow seeds, and hopefully the seeds that I've contributed to the environment will continue to exist beyond me here at UNC Greensboro. Let's see, somebody popped up in the chat. Oh yeah, John, thank you, Sean. So one of the, obviously this is something, our connectedness to the land has been happening for a long time, as long as people have been wearing clothes and making the effort to put their mark on the world. People have been using and finding color in the world around them. So for example, woad, which is a plant that makes blue and is very common in Europe, has been around for over 10,000 years. They found this in archaeological sites, like all over the world, but primarily in Europe and Mediterranean. Indigo, which is the most common, commonly everybody should know, indigo makes blue. It's been around for 6,000 years. At least that's the evidence that they found. Indigo is a hot weather plant, so it mostly grows in Asia and in South America, and there's several varieties. Here in America, indigo that we can find was probably brought over by enslaved Africans. So we have here in America a very complicated history with indigo. But it's interesting to think about how people travel with these seeds, and they bring something of the land that they started with them to the places that they end up in. And that's something that's a really interesting aspect of human culture when you think about this ethnobotany, spirit of place aspect of, like, you can bring the spirit of some place with you. Tyrian purple, which is, there's been evidence of Tyrian purple, which is a purple that's made from mollusks from the sea. It was very precious and very expensive to make. And that's why there were certain rules that they made that only kings could wear purple. And that's one of the reasons why we think of purple as royalty. And we know that that's been around since 1500 BCE. And then the madder plant, which was brought over to Europe by the Vikings, makes red, and that has been around since 2500 BCE. And then cochineal, if you don't know that plant product, is actually a scale insect that grows on prickly pear cactuses. And from what they can tell, that's been around since the medieval times. And if you're an artist and you know the terminology carmine red, that was manufactured from cochineal. So all of these things help us ground us in this idea that, color is very connected to our human culture in this particular way, and that it moves around, and it has this sort of helps ground us in the place that we're in. And I'll talk about why we don't see yellow and green on this on this particular color scale in just a minute too. Okay, so the dye process is a little bit complicated, and that's one of the reasons why natural dyes fell out of fashion. Now, I'm very gratified that in the last 10 years they've been coming back into fashion as we've gone, as the climate crisis has become more recognized in the fashion system. And that's because it's a labor-intensive process, and it takes materials to make, unlike synthetic dyes, which are much more easily manufactured at an industrial scale. My feeling is that local dyes, you there's a respect that happens between you and the land when you're taking plants to use for local dyes. And that's hard to do when you're talking about industrial manufacturing and growing. So the process is pretty time consuming, and it involves, you have to clean the fiber, and then there's something called mordanting, which helps fix the color to the fiber. And then you do the dye, and then you have to test it to make sure it's going to last. You can use natural dye plants to stain stuff all day long. Like if you've ever gotten a grass stain, you know, it's going to put some color on your clothing, but there's actually a very labor intensive and time consuming process in order to make this something that lasts. But however, I don't think that should inhibit us from playing with the color that we find in our environment. And when I say environment, I also include our kitchens, and I'll talk about that soon. So the things to know about natural dyes, this is an image from my parents' property off the Appalachian Trail in the mountains of North Carolina. I was testing some solar dyes. And the things to know about natural dyes is it's not a fast process. So for example, solar dyes, you have to leave them in the sun for at least 24 to 48 hours to get any color out of them. But it's quite fun to do that because it means that you can just put some plants in jars, pour some water on them, throw in some test fabric and walk away and do your thing for the rest of the summer. Some people in Asia even do this by adding a little bit of alcohol, and they will leave their dye plants in those jars for months. I did an experiment with dye plants here in Greensboro last year because I wanted to try this technique. And I got some interesting colors, which I will show you here. You can kind of see this is Pokeberry, which is considered a weed, but makes some lovely pinks. I'm still doing some tests on it. These fabrics are unmordanted, meaning I wasn't worried about like making them last. I was just trying to see if the plants brought some color. One of the other ones that I did was, I believe this is the one. This is a very light version, but this is some marigolds that I grew in the garden. So the joke in natural dye world is that everything makes yellow. So when you're doing natural dye tests, you will get yellow from just about every plant. Grass clippings, most flowers. It's very tricky to get other colors, but there's some beautiful yellows you can get. And I think this is like, you can kind of see it. It's a little slightly different color. But magnolia, these are magnolia buds, those little crunchy things that you see in the fall that are kind of orange in color. And I think that it would give a very nice orange had I mordanted the fabric. So the important things to know about foraging for these natural dyes materials is that you got to know your plants. Obviously, you don't want to use poison ivy for your experiments. And you also, there's some, what I think of as some rules. If you're working with some of the mineral salts and other things that come with natural dyes, you're going to want to use safety gear, and you want to dispose of them properly. Most of the advantage of working with natural dyes is that almost all of the materials will break down pretty quickly in compost. So you're not talking about waste that's generating more toxic stuff for the environment. But you also want to adhere to what it is kind of the rule of thumb in herbalism, is that there's this little phrasing that's like, you take one for yourself, and you leave one for the bees, and you leave one for the plant. So you're only taking a third of the plant, really. So you want to leave stuff in the environment. So it's different. It's kind of this different relationship that we have with the plant. You're not going to like take all the flowers. You're going to leave some there in the process. And that's the kind of rule of thumb that I follow. So if I see a plant that's growing by itself, I probably won't take it because it's not enough to share. We might want to leave that plant by itself instead of over harvesting, as we are so prone to do as humans. The other thing to talk about here is that natural dyes work best on cellulose and protein fibers, and they don't work very well on synthetic fibers such as polyester. The other thing that's true is that synthetic fibers take a very long time to break down in say they're in landfill. but cellulose and protein fibers will still break down relatively quickly. So rather than contributing to more waste, I try to use found, dead stock fiber that I've had or has been given to me. I don't use synthetics because they don't dye at all. Basically, you would have, in order to dye synthetics, you have to dye plastic with plastic. So I prefer to use cotton, linen, or silk and wool. Silk and wool take the color much more readily. So for example, with that pokeberry, this is the silk is the bright pink, and you can see this is a linen, and it didn't take the dye nearly as well. So that's a really interesting thing about natural dyes. It just has to do with how the fibers are absorbed, how it absorbs the dye. What else can I talk about here? A little bit more about mordants. If you don't know, the word mordant is comes from the French. It means to, what does it mean? It comes from the French word meaning to bite, because it's how it helps the dye integrate on a molecular level into the material. I'm not going to go into the chemical processes of what all the different mordants are, but the common ones that we use are mineral salts such as iron, copper, or tin. So I always imagine that when, in the early days of natural dyes, that people still do this, is that they would use cooking pots made from those materials. So for example, in India, they still use these copper vat dyes, these big pots to dye things, and those copper pots act as a mordanting bath for the natural dye process. You can also use plants that have natural tannins in them, such as tea. For example, if you've ever spilled tea or coffee on yourself, you know that it leaves a stain. That's actually a great dye. But there's some other unusual plants, like the scarf that I'm wearing is made from avocado pits, which has a natural tannin in it. And there are other plants like black walnut, which I have right here. If anybody has a black walnut tree or seen a black walnut tree in their backyard, they make these green balls that fall in the autumn. And these are some that I saved. We have a black walnut tree behind 326 State. So there's part of my local color experiment right there. Black walnut, and most nuts have natural tannins in them, so they do some really interesting, that you can get a wide range of colors from those tannins. There's a lot of other traditions in other countries where they don't necessarily use mineral salts, but they'll use fixatives such as soy milk, salt, or vinegar to help set the dyes. These dyes don't last as long, but the soy milk process is really interesting. That in Japan, they've been using that for thousands of years to make all those beautiful shibori tie-dye prints. They use it as paste. They'll use like a mix of soy milk and rice flour as a paste to do these beautiful prints. And I've experimented a little bit with that process. It's a little bit labor intensive because you have to basically make soy milk in the blender and then dye your materials in it. So you're not only are you doing the dye process, you're also making the soy milk, but the soy milk it works great. So that's an interesting thing to explore, and you can do that at home. These are the different kinds of things that you can use for natural dyes. This in the middle is a picture of kudzu, which is, I did a few experiments with that this summer, but it has promise, but I'd need a lot more of it. I only had like a couple of these, I think they look like peas kind of, right? I guess they are kind of in a legume family, but they produced kind of this teal green. So I'm interested to explore that a little bit more. And this plant was from, my parents live above Asheville, North Carolina. So this was from an area outside of Asheville, but we also have a Kudzu Vine behind our building here, even at the 326 State. So you can use just about anything: flowers, fruit, leaves, barks, roots. That's what I've been experimenting with here at UNC Greensboro. So some of the things that I've experimented with from our campus are acorns, hickory nut. There's some St. John's wort that grows out in front of Brown building on our campus. And I use that to make some yellow. I've also used magnolia, marigold, which I grew, various rose hips that have grown around campus. And the way that I forage is basically by, I like to pick up spent blossoms and things that I'm not actually picking things. I'm usually picking it up off the ground as if it were waste. I've also started experimenting more with earth because North Carolina has that great red clay. And there's all kinds of pigments that can come directly out of the earth. And those are in process, so to be determined. This spring, I also have, I've gotten some Camellia from my backyard, which is that beautiful pink flower that you see opening right now, although there are other varieties. Apparently there's some traditions in Australia that have used this as a natural dye. So right now I have some hot water, so I'm going to pour that in there and see what happens in the next 15 minutes or so. We'll see what happens. I've also got some I dried some hyacinths, which are also growing in my backyard, and it's this beautiful pink color, and that they might produce something. We'll see. And it's a little bit, that's a little bit of my process, is like put some stuff in a jar, pour some hot water on it, and see what happens. It's a little bit of an experimentation process. It's not very scientific. Sometimes it's kind of lazy, but it can be really an interesting thing to think about, of like, how many different shades of yellow and pink can I get today? And the other thing that I have experimented with is food waste. There's a bunch of different kinds of foods that you can use to make natural dyes. You don't even have to use the full item. You can use, for example, like freezer burned cranberries that you've had in the freezer since Thanksgiving, or blueberries perhaps that are a little mushy. There's different kinds of wood if you're ever doing like clearing behind your house or something, like cherry bark makes a beautiful red. Yellow, what's it called? Kentucky coffee. There's different kinds of trees that make natural dyes. I've even used rusty cans, which does some really interesting things. Basically, if you wrap fabric around a rusty can, you can get some really interesting effects, because rust is a natural mordant. It's an iron-based mordant. So there's this whole school of thought of using human rust waste to make fiber more interesting. These are some dye materials from the kitchen. You can see it's a pretty extensive list. One of the things to note is that green is very hard to achieve from natural dyes in the wild. So you'll mostly get a gray green, but generally speaking, green is only achieved by mixing something that's blue with something that's yellow. And so it's one of those elusive things. But you can get some really interesting greens from a lot of the herbs that you like, common garden herbs, and by doing something called color shifting, where you take something that has some tannins in it, like marigold. Let's see if I have some here. I do, behind me. So this is some wool that I did this summer. This is a white wool that was dyed with marigold in July, and this is marigold that's been shifted with iron mordant. So you can see that you can get quite these radical shifts with iron mordant when you do them. And there's here's another example here. You can see here's cochineal. It makes this really beautiful pink on wool. And then when you dip it in iron, it turns a darker purple. So there's this really fun stuff. You start to feel really, it starts to feel like alchemy when you're working with it, as you discover these. And these are not like those are not local color necessarily. I was doing some dye experiments with some tried and true dyes through a class this summer. But I like to show them because it really shows you like how vibrant they can be. Cool. I think that's it. This is, I just wanted to show you this last thing. If you're interested in this kind of thing, this is a class or workshop I did with food-based paint. And basically I did essentially what I did just now with the camellia flowers. I poured some hot water on it and created these different paints and added some soy milk. And we used those to create some t-shirts and do some watercolor paint in process. And this is one of the ways, it's a great way to work with kids because it's non-toxic, also for college students. And you don't have a lot of, there's the hardest part is the pre-prep time. There's not a lot of toxicity that you're generating. It's just a fun project to do about showing different colors you can create. The ones I used for this class, I tried to do a rainbow and did things like black beans, which makes it purple, blueberries, cabbage. Cabbage will pH shift between purple and blue, depending on whether you add an acid or an alkaline substance like baking soda. I use onion skins, spinach, turmeric, and I think coffee. That was the other one. So we use those to create these t-shirts. And that's something that I'm hoping to do here at UNC Greensboro as well as we move forward. And finally, I know that we're coming up on a celebration of spring, Easter. If you're interested in doing natural color dyes, here's your opportunity. Basically, you can take some onion skins. These are all natural dyed eggs that I did a couple years ago. These are wooden. I didn't use real eggs, but it's the same idea that you can use with, if you celebrate Easter, or you want to dye some eggs a different color for some reason. You can use all these different plants to create some really beautiful colors. So this was cabbage, turmeric, and onion skins. I think I did 2 different kinds of onion skins. I think the redder one is red onion skin, and the yellower one is yellow onion skin. And I consider these food-based experiments part of my environment as well. So that's part of the local color idea. You're just connecting to your environment in a different way. And you're also getting a little bit more use out of what you're putting into the waste pile or into the compost. So let's see, what else do I have to share? If anybody wants some onion skins, I always have them. I have a big bag right here. Right here, onion skins. And I'm hoping to do, I have some indigo as well, and I'm hoping to do some more indigo experiments here in a couple of months once we have some more good weather, because it needs a pretty warm environment in order to make a proper indigo vat. That's all I have for today. Do we want to open the floor for some questions?
Thanks, Tara. You did have one question in the chat from Simran, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Which should you use hot water or cold water?
You can use either. If you're going to use cold water, I would suggest like putting the jar in the sun for a few days. But I like to use hot water because it's a more immediate, or even like a little bit of boiling water, because it's a more immediate effect. And you know, you can use, if you're use watercolors, you can use this to color. If you get a pigment, you can use that to experiment with watercolors, which is often what I'll do to just see what I get. Or you can, like, if you're interested in fiber experiments, you can just throw some fiber in there and see what happens. Sometimes you'll get some beautiful colors. Most of the time you'll get yellow. I mean, that is that is a thing. You'll get a lot of yellow. And you can also shift those colors if you want, with some iron. And yeah.
That's great. We'll go to Aaron, and then we'll go to Amber's question in the chat.
Sure.
Aaron.
Thanks, Tara. This has been, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
I've had total technical meltdowns that I don't understand what was going on anyway. So I missed little pieces of your talk, but there are 2 little things I just wanted to bring up because I've found this really cool and unexpectedly connected to some of the stuff that I do. The first one is about green. You mentioned some of the problems with green.
Yeah.
And if you know more about this, elaborate, please, because it's really the question here with green. There's the irony of green, that we talk about green being an environmentally friendly color, yet you were talking about how you couldn't really get decent greens from the environment.
Yeah.
And if I recall correctly, the greens that we see in kind of industrial inks or even soy-based inks or whatever are quite toxic. Is that the case?
Yes. Because usually it's a lot of the greens that we use are still based on copper, which is quite toxic for people. And so the greens, at least in my knowledge, because I'm still growing my knowledge of natural dyes, it's usually a two-step process. So there's no, I can occasionally get green from, say, doing a bath with like some really pulverized spinach. But it's very hard to find a green that lasts. So most people get green by combining yellow and blue dyes, or combining yellow with iron, and then you kind of get these olivey gray green dyes. So I find it so fascinating as well, because you think like, oh, we go outside and we'll just like chop some plants up and we'll get some green from the chlorophyll. It doesn't work that way.
Indeed. Yeah, of course, I use copper for, I grow apple trees and I use copper when very small quantities when I need to, because it's an organic use for dealing with fungal infections and these kinds of things. So anyway, I've noticed that, it's brilliant color, but I never made the connection there, obviously, as to why that would be the issue. So thanks for elaborating on that. I'm a woodworker and I do a lot with wood, and have noticed a lot of, you mentioned how wood can be a dye and do some.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are two little things about wood that I wanted to share. One, did you mention Pernambuco? Because I heard you talking about cochineal and some other things. And
I didn't. There's so many.
I know. Do you know about Pernambuco?
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me because it was originally, it was this extraction from Brazil. It's the wood that gave Brazil its name. And it's just a common locust tree essentially, but a particular variety of it. And it was brought to Europe and it was used to dye regal garments like you're talking about with purple. And then a clockmaker and amateur musician found some pieces of it and made some violin bows out of it. And it is now the most sought after and wood for making elite violin bows and cello bows and everything else. And it was basically accidentally discovered because of its use as a dye.
Yeah, I've got some right here actually. I think this is some wool that's been dyed with that.
Oh, cool. And so do you grind it? Do you like use sawdust, or do you?
Yeah, it's like, and it smells so good. I mean, some of these dyes, I can't even tell you. It's such a different experience to dye with this versus like RIT. So it's amazing.
The other little wood that has come, and this was my real question here, was that I use a lot is poplar, and we have a lot of poplar on my land in West Virginia, and we'll do construction work with it and mill the poplar ourselves. And when we mill it, certain of the trees have this absolutely gorgeous purple orange staining in it, and I can never. I've worked with a woodworker as well who's tried to do similar things. I've always used natural oils to finish wood, like tung oil or walnut oil or things like that, linseed oil. And I never used any synthetics or anything like that, but I worked with a woodworker who did, and he also had trouble fixing that. So you're talking about fixing, and this is also where I missed some of the things that you're talking about, but about how you kind of seal that color. And I wonder if you've had any experience with trying to capture that color and try and, because it turns basically to brown after a while, and it's just so spectacular. I would love to try and fix it in some wood.
Yeah, so the egg, for example, those Easter eggs that I did, not really Easter, I'm not that religious, but I wanted to dye some wood because my father is also a woodworker, and those wooden eggs are there's a process that you can do with cellulose materials like cotton and linen, and also wood, because it's cellulose, where you add aluminum sulfate, or I think it's aluminum sulfate, which is the common dye mineral salt that we use as a mordant. And so those eggs were soaked in alum and then went into the dye bath, and they're fading now. It's been like, I think 3 years, but that helped fix the color. I don't know about poplar. It might, you might be able to do a wash and see if that seals it. I have no idea. No, you know, it's worth an experiment.
Totally. That's exactly what I was going for. I'll try that with some aluminum salt.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really
Yeah, no problem.
fascinating stuff. Thanks so much.
No problem.
Thanks, Aaron. Amber, did you want to unmute, or you had a question about soy milk?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just for the process, I noticed on the table that it looked like there was dye in the milk. So were you
Yes.
milk?
Yeah, so I both pre-soaked the t-shirts in soy milk, which is the traditional process where you pre-soak them for like 24 hours in the soy milk until it starts to ferment a little bit, and then you take them out and let them dry for another 24 hours. So it kind of cures into the cotton. And what my theory is, I haven't done a lot of research onto the science of this, but soy has a protein in it, and what you're doing is coating the cotton in a protein. And so when we did the painting experiment, I added soy milk to the paint as well, which is I've had really good luck with, because you can actually add a thickener, like whether it's flour or agar or gum arabic, and you create like a little paste, and then the pigment stays on the fabric a little longer, and then you get these really nice prints with it. I hope that answers your question, Amber.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Does anybody else have any other? Oh, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. I really learned a lot from your talk. Found this really interesting. I have a question to kind of like bring water and streams into this. So I do work on North Buffalo Creek, including at Revolution Mill, which I came across like this sort of report that said that back when the mill was in operation, at times the creek would like have this like dark blue color from the dyes when they were like dyeing the jeans.
Yes. Yes.
And what I read was that was indigo that they were using.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, like, okay, so indigo is a natural dye, but would like those large quantities of indigo have had like negative effects on water quality? And then like kind of related to this, like now that much of the textile production has moved to like South Asia, India, Bangladesh, you occasionally hear news reports of like huge releases of dyes from these factories, and like, you know, blue dogs like wandering around and stuff.
Yeah.
So, and those I assume are synthetic dyes that would be
Yes.
more toxic and you know, harmful to ecosystem and human health. So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between like, okay, dyes and the textile industry and water quality.
Yeah. So water quality dyes are very water consuming. It's a huge part of the process, and especially when you're talking about and even in the growing process, right? Because if you start dealing with an industrial scale, you're talking about like agriculture takes a lot of water. So there's more and more people who are doing research into less water consumptive processes. But I've seen exactly what you're talking about. Textile in the textile industry, I think it's like 60% of global pollution is from the fashion industry. I mean, it's some absurd number. I don't have the numbers right in front of me. But you still will see, I've got overhead images of rivers in China that are bright pink. It's still a huge part of the waste process on the industrial scale. The indigo from plants, it does affect water quality, because again, there's chemicals involved in the mordanting process. When you're talking about doing it at a local level for like on a personal scale, it's a much different thing. You're looking at all of the mineral salts. My understanding is that they break down pretty quickly in the environment after being exposed to oxygen for a certain amount of time. But when we're talking about like putting things into the water stream, definitely like anything industrial manufacturing, I would really question like if that's safe. Although I'm really curious, because I've been in conversation with TS Designs, which is in Burlington, and they have just recently converted their dye vats to natural dyes. So they're doing t-shirts with madder, black walnut, marigold, pomegranate, and I'd be curious to hear what their processes are. And they just started opening their manufacturing facility back to tours, but you know, maybe that's be interesting to talk to them about that. Like how are they handling that? Because, you know, it's a lot of water when you're talking about, you know, 1 million t-shirts that are being produced.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I always sort of wondered if there was like any way, like any sort of like record that like, you know, we could detect in the sediments of the stream bed, you know, from these which I assumed it was like probably like it would have broken down by now, which sounds like consistent with what you're saying. But
Yeah,
it's just interesting to think about like that history, like right here in Greensboro.
I would think to look for the minerals. Like a high toxicity of copper, for example, would indicate that they're doing some kind of greens. Or some of the indigo. What's interesting about indigo and what makes me think that it's, you know, less toxic than say a synthetic is that you have to ferment it to get the blue out of the leaves anyway. And so you've already started this composting process. It is quite literally a composting process. So when that goes into the water table, it's going to be less toxic than something that's made from petroleum products, for example. So that'd be an interesting comparison. If you want to work on that study, I'm down.
Yeah, let's talk.
Any other questions?
I have one.
Sure.
I was wondering, like, when you were talking about the mordants, and how they fix to the dyed the fabric and everything, and how the mordant can also change the color.
Mhm.
Is there like a science to knowing how or do you just kind of like learn with experience, like knowing how the mordant will change the color, or is it just kind of like you get what you get?
Yes, there is a science to it. It's quite complicated. So I don't even know. I've just begun to scratch that surface, but there are some standards that have been around for so long. For example, I know that copper, that's how we get green, but it's also very toxic. So most dyers don't use it anymore. However, I do have some iron mordant, and let me see if I have anything. I can throw something in there. Right behind me, and we'll see what happens. Yeah, here, this marigold. So iron does something to fabric called saddening, which I love. I love that that's a word, and it changes things to gray. So when you have something that's yellow, a lot of times it'll go green or gray. So there's things like that. These processes have been around long enough to know that, you know, so you're going to know what's going to happen. And iron is so powerful that you don't want to use the same pots that you use for iron mordants that you would use for like the rest of your dyes, because it will just sadden everything. Let me just throw this in. I have some iron mordant right here. This is from ferrous sulfate powder, and you can see how it looks like that rusty kind of pipe look. Let's see if this does anything. I don't know if it will. We'll see. I'm going to let that sit for a minute. Oh yeah, it's starting to go gray. I don't know if you can see this. Let's see how it's graying up a little bit there, starting to go green. So it's kind of magical that way. So I prefer to think of it as a magical thing. I know it's science, but that's how I like to think of it. So there's lots of different things. Oh yeah, it's really going there. Now it's starting to really go. So I like to just have a basic understanding of those processes. There are some mordants that work differently than others. There's a process for cellulose that's different from protein. Some of it is about just memorizing those things, and some of it's about experimentation. There's a great book that Catherine Ellis wrote with a colleague that goes through those scientific, like why that happens. And it has to do with the molecular structure of the dye. So for example, red dye is going to behave different from blue dye. And that's basically the what I can tell you right now. But we can go into that when you help me with some of this stuff later in the semester.
Thanks, Tara. I think we've got time for just a couple more things. And
Sure.
Exodus has a question, and then April also.
I saw
had her
April,
hand
yeah.
up for a second. Go ahead, Plexidus.
Hi. So Tara, very interesting presentation, learning a lot. So I'm just curious so I have a couple questions.
Sure.
So from what you have been working on with these natural dyes, have you come across, I remember one time I was on this hike with this lady, and she was talking about how Native Americans used like the black walnut
Mhm.
To dye things. And so I was just wondering, for people who are like, what did they use, like the Native Americans? And also I'm thinking about, like, you gave the example of Madagascar,
Mhm.
right? Where they might not have some of these access to some of these Mordants, right? Have you come across what people would use instead?
Yes. Yeah. So the process, if those mineral salts are not readily available, is to use tannins. So a lot of times what they'll do is pre-dye something that has a tannin in it. This is very common in India. For example, like acorns are a tannin, and they're pretty, oak trees are very common across the United States. I don't know about, and sumac is another one that the Native American indigenous peoples here in the United States would use. And what it does is this is the cool thing. Yellow makes a great base for dyes. And if it has a tannin in it, then you have a natural mordant that helps fix that color to the materials, especially if it's a cotton. Now, cotton wasn't around for, in the United States until the last few hundred years. So they were probably using like wools and more protein-based things like leather. So those are easier to dye, or, and they don't need the same kind of mordanting process. But tannins is the thing that it's a little bit of a lengthy process to use tannins with natural dye materials, but it works great.
Have you come across people using henna for
Yes, henna is
fabric?
Very commonly used. Yeah, and it's beautiful. It makes
the reason why I'm asking about henna is so I'm sensitive to a lot of the like hair color. So but I don't have problems with henna. But I noticed that if I want to have a darker shade, I use black tea so I guess explaining what you're saying and talking about protein and all that really kind of making sense about this. But I just wondering if you'd use henna because for fabrics as well.
Yeah, henna is quite commonly used with indigo because it's got such a great tannin property, and so it makes these beautiful blues when used with henna. And that blue black color that's so often used in hair sometimes has indigo. Used to have indigo in it to give it that beautiful color. So yeah, henna is great. I've used that a couple of times. And then there's another one that's really common called, what's the name of that? It's a gall nut. It's basically a kind of, when there's a wasp that lands on oak trees, and the oak will secrete tannin. It's like almost pure tannin around where the wasp tries to lay its eggs. And they grind them up and use them as a mordant.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
That's
April,
Hi, yeah. So I had more of like a thought or a comment about Sarah's question about how the indigo dye would affect like the stream.
I just want to show you this. This is what the iron did to the marigold after being in there for a few minutes. So there's that green. Anyway, sorry about that, April. Go ahead.
That's okay. Like I was thinking about, her comment about, how the indigo might affect the stream. And I know a lot of people dye their ponds, like obviously not with indigo, with like the synthetic stuff, but it would probably alter your community structure of your stream a lot because you're reducing your algae load, and it also tends to hide your fish from your predators, like your birds of prey. So it would be interesting to see, if you had a place that had that, how the community structure would change versus a place who wasn't getting that indigo input. But I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, it's that's one of the things that I think is really interesting to think about is like how, and that's why I like to think of this as how we connect to our place, the ecosystem that we're in. And so using natural dyes, at least for me, really grounds me in this relationship with the land that I think is really an important thing to remember in this day and age when we're like on, have technology surrounding us all the time. There's pavement everywhere. People are using the synthetics. We've got microplastics showing up in the environment. So that's one of the reasons why I think this is so exciting and important to talk about.
Yeah, and it cuts across a lot of different things. April, maybe you and me and Tara should like get together and like do something on like indigo dye in North Buffalo Creek. So that could be an interesting collaboration.
Yeah. And indigo really thrives. It doesn't like chlorine. So it really thrives if you have rainwater, stream water. It's much better process if you have like some kind of natural water source. So that's why all those plants are right next to the river, unfortunately.
Well, thank you so much, Tara. That was great. As I mentioned before, we will have these posted on YouTube, and really appreciate everybody coming today. And I hope you all have a very good weekend.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Sean. I so appreciate you.
Appreciate
Thank you.
More
Cheers,
soon.
everyone.